Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me nearer, nearer, blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side. Song of Invitation is 348. 348. Let me try to fix the projector. Oh, there we go. No, it's not as bad as I thought it was. It got jammed up, and sometimes it gets worse. Got lucky. It's not so messed up after all. So we're going to finish the book of Zechariah. So we got a lot to kind of cover, and it's been a couple of weeks when I covered chapter 13. So I'm going to try to do this without blasting through and forgetting or losing some of the essence of what this book is about, because it is an important book when it comes to the prophecy concerning the Messiah. And so I want to kind of go back and look at the context. The social context is always important, because if we don't understand what's going on historically, what are some of the political events that have been occurring around them, we don't understand why the letter was written. We don't understand the social context of what they're dealing with and what's in the future. So it is important that when you do study a book, especially of the prophets, that you put that into historical. Go outside the Bible, look at the history, because it really will help you to understand what's going on. So the book of Zechariah is written around 520 BC. So we're looking at about 520 years before the Messiah comes. Now, in our world, that's a long time. That's forever, 500 and something years. But in the prophetic, in God's mind, it's narrow. The time is really coming down pretty quick. So when we look at that and consider it, what has gone on? Well, in 586, now remember, time's getting smaller as it goes to Christ's birth. So 586, they went into captivity, the southern tribe, Judah. They go to Babylon, they come out of Babylon, and they're rebuilding the temple. Very discouraged. There's other prophecies that are dealing with trying to re-encourage them to get that temple built. They cannot see the glory of Solomon's temple. Some of them are actually old enough to remember it. So there's some discouragement there. There's also some external pressures that are happening to them because other nations around them don't want them to build that temple. So And we also need to remember, those who came back, yes, they are kind of the remnant, because not all of them returned. Think about it. 70 years, they become pretty rooted in the areas that they had been dispersed in. And so those who do come back, yes, they're zealous and they're eager, but it doesn't mean that they're very spiritually grounded. So they're very worldly. They're Babylon. They're Persian. They have more of that Middle Eastern culture and ideology and such. So they've got that to deal with. Come back and not only build this temple, reestablish themselves in the city of Jerusalem, but they've got to pull out. They got to come out of the old culture that they've been living in during captivity. So this is what the message is. The message of these prophets around that time period are trying to get them to get motivated on building, getting the sacrifice going, reestablishing, reinitiating that covenant relationship that they had with God through Abraham, and to clean up yourself morally and society. So they're building a nation state, they're building a temple, a lot of challenges. So these priests are trying to struggle with Zerubbabel and Joshua are the leaders. And so they're trying to guide them, and those are the key leaders during this time that Zechariah is dealing with, is the ones who are trying to, through the government and then through the priesthood, get them going. So the book of Zechariah, it is, I keep saying this because it is very important when we think about it, because a lot of times when it comes to the Messiah and you say, well, what book would you think of when it comes to the most verses talking about the Messiah? And a lot of times people go to Isaiah, and that's a good one. It's a good default one, and it's got a lot of them in there. But the book of Zechariah, per verse, there are more prophecies around the Messiah coming than any prophetic book. It's a smaller book than most of them, but the message is pretty dead on and speaking about it. But the first chapters are dealing with visions. And those visions become complicated because we look at this idea of symbology. And again, we almost need to go take a class and just learn how God speaks through the prophets in symbols. And those are important. Horses, colors, numbers, things like this that are important. Clouds, mountains, and all these things. You really need to understand those. And that's a big fallacy of a lot of people who don't study the Old Testament prophets, but jump right to the book of Revelation. What mountains represented to God when he used it to try to draw a parallel to something in Revelation meant the same thing that he dealt with in the Old Testament. The prophets are the same. When it means in clouds, coming in clouds, it meant the same thing that it means in Revelation. The language is the same. That's where a lot of fallacies occur because people are taking and reapplying the symbology to something modern in the book of Revelation. So it is important for us to be able to understand that, but not for us to get so wrapped up that we're going to fight over it because most of it is a positive message of bringing the Messiah in. And there's greater things to think about. So when we look at these visions, the first one was a horseman, and that's God's involvement in the world, sending out his messengers, and this idea of him promising and patrolling and giving a time for restoration, that they're not going to be overrun. And so that was the horseman. The four horns and the four craftsmen in the next vision was dealing around with the four horns of power. Remember, horns? That's another word that you kind of need to put in your vocabulary when you're dealing with prophetic language. Horns, and so those were nations. And those are the four that had basically oppressed or were a threat. So, but the craftsmen, the four craftsmen in this vision, were going to come behind and just take away their power, take it away so that they could focus on the building. Then the third vision was a surveyor, one that goes forward and surveys and tells what's going on. And really it's talking about this great expansion of Jerusalem beyond what they're building physically right then and there and trying to put bricks and mortar to the wall. This vision kind of tells them, hey, you're not going to be able to put a wall around this one. Wait a minute, every city needs a wall. So there's that illusion of, yeah, you're going to put a wall, you're going to survey the physical Jerusalem you're dealing with, but the greater vision of that application was a spiritual greatness of Jerusalem. Hold on to that, because Jerusalem as well is going to be an important word, how we use it when we come to this chapter 14. So that's the surveyor, depicting the forecast of the future. And then this cleansing of the high priest Joshua and the accuser coming, and how that Satan's attacking and his adversary, but God and Jesus, the Messiah, defends the high priest, and the changing of his garments is symbolic of taking away the sin and bringing the purification in the priesthood. That is a messianic toward Christ in being the high priest in the New Testament. And then we have the one of the two lampstands, the two olive trees that are feeding this oil, and it's illustrating the power of God's Spirit and how that Spirit is able to then keep them sustained. And that is trying to get Zerubbabel and Joshua, Zerubbabel the king and Joshua the priest, to encourage them. They're the two branches that they're sustaining this new growth. Then the next vision is a flying scroll. This flying scroll is showing and pronouncing a judgment that's going out all over and pronouncing a judgment on sin. Remember I talked about how, yeah, they may come back and they may be dedicated to God, but they're still struggling. You just throw a new church together and bring a bunch of people together, and you're still going to have some personal problems, and you're going to have some issues. So this one was one you need to clean up. You got to get rid of sin. And so it's that next ties into the next one. Not only God is going to send that flying scroll, and he's going to pronounce on liars and thieves and this idea of sin, but then the next vision, the woman in the basket, which is pretty bizarre and sometimes hard to understand, but he puts this wicked woman in a basket and then sends it off to Babylon. Again, another word that needs to be in your dictionary when it comes to prophets is Babylon, the use of Babylon. That's also used in Revelation. So God always looks at Babylon as a wicked place. So sending a woman in a basket off to Babylon is to abandon and to get rid of and remove. Then we have the four chariots. The eighth vision represents his judgment in the four corners of the earth, that his judgment is going to be sustained all across the earth. And then the final one is this symbolic crowning of Joshua. Now, I don't know if you picked up, but Joshua's not the king. Zerubbabel's the king. So there's this crowning of a priest. Well, that should never happen. You can't have that. But that's a shadow of God showing that the priest and kingship is going to be in the Messiah. And so to the Jew that heard that, they might have gone, are you sure you saw that right, Zechariah? I mean, the crown should have been put on Zerubbabel. So that one is a really great one that helps to show us that. That's important. Those were all the encouraging ones. Then in the middle, we have chapter 7 and 8, where we deal with a question on fasting. When they were off in captivity, they fasted. And why did they fast? Well, they fasted because they had sin and regret and what they had done to cause them to come into captivity. So they come back and they ask the question, should we maintain these fasts? And God, through kind of a rhetorical question, is like, well, why were you doing it? Were you really doing it for me? And then he turns it around and basically says, he shows how, no, this is a restoration. This is a period of joy. This is a time to get back to the feast that we established. Why do you want to go and fast? We're putting away that. So he kind of uses that as a time to teach them about no. He questions the motives. Why do you want to do that? No. And so what does he do? He calls them to do what they need to do that simply is the most important, and that is to focus on justice and mercy. And now it's interesting because a lot of times you think, well, what would he have them focus on? The Mosaic Law, the 10 Commandments. Focus on the 10 Commandments. If you can follow the 10 Commandments. But think about it's even deeper. Justice and mercy. Those are the foundation. If you don't have those, you're not going to follow the 10 Commandments. If you have justice and mercy and those things, you're going to follow and obey. That's what was broke with them. Externally, they would obey the 10 Commandments. But their hearts, they weren't just. They weren't merciful. And so it's a beautiful way of God showing it's not just about the acts. It's about what is truly in your heart. And then in 8 through 23, he goes through and talks about the promises of restoration, And you say, well, we're getting restored now. That's what we're doing. This is a period of restoration. Well, there's always that shadow. There is a rest that Joshua has laid aside, that yes, they had a rest in coming to promised land, but there's always been the prophets pointing to this other final rest that Joshua never provided. And this is a blending in these messages and what he's showing here as well. And God assures them of this blessing and the prosperity and the return of his presence in Zion. See, that was the most important. Where's God's presence? To the Jew, it's like, well, when we were wandering, we could see the cloud by day, the firestorm at night. We knew where he dwelt. And when God removes his presence from the Holy of Holies, they were in trouble. And so God is showing. So now think about it. Physically, they're building the temple. They want his presence to come back. And so he's giving them that, yeah, my presence will come back. But again, through the prophecies, it's something greater about his presence with his chosen people. And so that brings you up to 8. The last section gets really historical and starts to tie in some of the prophecies that Daniel had talked about when he prophesied about the statue and the coming nations and kingdoms that were coming. If you'll recall back in Daniel, he had this vision. Nebuchadnezzar had a vision. He explains that vision, starting from the different elements of gold all the way down and through the feet. Each section of the statue represented a nation. There were 4 of them. And so one of them was Babylon. The next one was Persia. The third one was going to be Greece. And the fourth one was going to be Rome. Now think about if you were reading Daniel 200 years later, and you know the Babylons fell, and you knew that the Persians were now ruling, you could start to kind of figure out when this Messiah is coming. Then Daniel had given them a more specific dates as well. But when we look at that, he talked about that nearly 100 plus years about those four nations rising up. They are now, right now, when Zechariah is teaching, in the second one. And the third one, Greece, is on the horizon. I mean, we're at 540 BC, and Alexander the Great is going to rise up around 230. And Zechariah has gone through, we already looked at, describing almost the exact campaign, how Alexander the Great comes through and what he does to cities such as Tyre, and depicts Alexander the Great at a time when they would have looked at Greece and went, Greece, really? No way. And so they're within less than 100 years of Alexander the Great coming. So why I'm saying this is then after Alexander the Great, he died young. His kingdom's divided up into four. And a part of that most significant two kingdoms of those generals that take that empire is Ptolemy. He's going to be in the southern toward Egypt, and then the Seleucid. And that is the influence. Antiochus Epiphanes is going to be a ruler in this area of influence where Jerusalem's at. And he is going to be a really hater of the Jews, and he's going to do everything he does in power to try to stop them from worshiping. And this is the Maccabean period. And that's what these chapters, as we shift from 9 to 14, almost become historical, predictive, and showing historically how these are going to start to happen, and they did. And so one of the messages was how that this Maccabean revolt, even though he never uses the word Maccabean, but shows how this revolt of the priests were going to rise up and push off the evilness of what the Epiphanes Antiochus was going to do to them, but that was going to usher in the fourth kingdom, and that's going to bring the Romans. And so it's beautiful the way you can go back and look at some of the videos of the previous chapters as I had gone through them. So this leads us up to then when we come into 13 and 14, which is very important, because now we're moving towards two oracles that are going to be important. One is going to be an oracle of judgment and salvation, and this idea of the Messiah is going to focus more on the Messiah than what it has in the past, and really bring to this end of 14 how this great victory is finally going to happen. The restoration of Israel, there are some important words, and I don't want to slow down and necessarily dig into them, but I'll just hit them. We did cover some of these. Some words that, like I said, we need to look at these 13 and 14, especially together when it comes to the key words. One of them is that's repeated over and over again is the word in that day. Or another way, some ESV is in that day, New King James and others is on that day. Now, so when we say that, we think sometimes, is it a singular event or can it be a plurality of events? Because if you look at them, there's a lot happening in one day. There's so much between chapter 13 and 14. It's like, how do you get all that in one 24-hour period? Well, we know that when we look at the usage of word in that day, it's very similar to like if I was talking to my grandfather and my grandmother, and they were to start talking about the Depression era and they'd say, in that day, we used to have to walk and go get flour. And in that day, I remember gasoline shortages. And in that day, we had to use food stamps. So that's not one single day. That's a time period, see? So that's important. So we are on through 13 and 14 in that day. And that's important because when you think about that, it's all around the Messiah. How do we know that? Well, man, when we read through there, when we read things like he arrives on a donkey, strike the shepherd and the flock will flee. Whoa, we know where that was linked to in Matthew and the Gospels, specifically, just like that was fulfilled. They will pierce him They will look upon the one pierced. I mean, we can go over and over and look at 13 and see that it is a part of that day. So chapter 14, I want to say it because it is getting a little frustrating, but I want to say chapter 14 is not the second coming of Christ. It is the first coming. If you take 14 and pull it apart and then reverse engineer it from the book of Revelation, then you can make it what you want. You can make it look like it's another day, that it's the second coming somehow. But there's too many things that cannot be incongruent with this concept. It is all around the Messiah's arrival and coming. So we'll kind of keep it at that. And so the day of the Lord is going to happen, and it's this greater spiritual victory. Now, going back to Daniel again, the last kingdom after Rome was going to be this kingdom that was going to be a spiritual kingdom, a kingdom that would never, ever go away, a kingdom that would crush all the other kingdoms, and none of them could withstand it. This is the kingdom of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, that the prophets were pointing to. And that's what happened. Where's Rome today? Where's Persia? Where are all these nations that were trying to wail against God's people? Gone. Where's the Messiah's kingdom? It's still around. Now you have to supersede and think, you have to go a little beyond just the physical realm, but the spiritual kingdom cannot be touched. It will never be defeated. It was a victory beyond just the physical world. And the physical world, the church, has never been able to be crushed or snuffed out. If anything, it keeps growing faster and faster. So this is the projection of the Messiah arriving, his brutal death, his burial, his resurrection, and then his ascension and rule in this spiritual kingdom. I'm saying this because as we start to go ahead and read, I'm not going to stop and break down every little word, every little vocabulary, like the pots and certain things. But I want to keep that kind of refreshed in your mind to thinking about, as we read through this final chapter, that this is about the Messiah and the church and the kingdom. And it's not just one day, but it is a time period in that day. We are living in that day, by the way. We are in that day, that time period of the messianic rule. So now let's go ahead. Now let's get to 14. Let's start with verses 1 and 2 because it begins with a day, the Lord of judging and bringing forward. This is around historical as well. So what happened? We know that in 70 AD, the Romans, General Titus, Vespasian was the emperor at the time. His son, Titus, had been directed by his father to surround and totally destroy Jerusalem. There had been a rebellion building up since 68 BC AD, and Nero started trying to crush the rebellion, and in the middle of him trying to crush it, he dies, kills himself. There's a transitional period, and the Roman army kind of takes a hiatus, backs up. They have a year of flux between who's going to be the emperor. The general who was commanding that and trying to put the revolt down becomes the emperor. His son was also a general, and once Vespasian gets settled, he gives the order, take it out. And that's when he marches on Jerusalem, and this is historic, this is documented. He surrounded Jerusalem and proceeded to just totally destroy it. And there were 1.2 million Jews killed in that. One thing that Josephus brings up, and he apparently was a witness, a Jewish historian who was a turncoat for the Jews. He got captured by Titus in an earlier battle, and he's supposed to have committed suicide with everybody else, but somehow he was the last guy living in the cave, and he surrenders and somehow becomes buddies with Titus, the general, but he becomes one of the greatest Jewish historians that he writes. So Josephus, you'll hear about him, in the annals, the history of Josephus, but Josephus was there with Titus when Jerusalem was being burnt to the ground, and he mentions the fact there were no Christians. Now, if you go back and you tie in to Matthew 24 and you look over in Luke, when Jesus is warning about the destruction of Jerusalem coming, and in Luke, he's very specific. He says, when you see the army of abomination circle, run. Don't come off the roof and get your house, your coat, nothing. Just get out. And Jesus even describes how the encirclement's going to come. And basically in Judea, this oppression, this suppression of the Roman army coming in and fighting, and that there's going to be a lull in the fighting in that. And that's when Nero died. And Jesus is saying, that's when you need to head out, because the day of the Lord is coming. See, God saw it as a judgment. That's what he says through these prophets, and that's what we're going to see. So historically, that's what did happen. Zechariah in this, talking about this day of the Lord that's coming upon them, and listen to what he's saying. And it's hideous, and it was barbaric. It really was. The Romans did some you talk about crimes against humanity, they could have wrote the book on it. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall be cut off from that day. Now all the nations, you stop and you go, wait a minute, you said it was Rome. Well, if you look at the Roman army, it was comprised of all the nations, because it wasn't like a UN force. But they would take prisoners and they would take people from all the different regions and bring them in. So they were represented there. So this is that gathering, and that the way the destruction was going to occur. He shows a percent of those who are not going to be involved in it, but he starts out showing, and that is what the Roman army represents. And then 3 and 5, the Lord's inventory and victory, describing it and talking about this. And then the Lord shall go out and fight against those nations, as when he fights on the day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and on the Mount of Olives, and he shall split in two from east to west, a very wide valley, so that one half of the mountain shall move northward and the other half southward. This is very prophetic language. We know the mountains never split. The Lord never came down physically and stood. So this is all symbolic. And tying in again with like what Josephus had documented, that there was a period that allowed God's people to escape. And that was the Lord providing and taking care of them. So this is symbolic, but also showing north and south was the spread of going out. But the Lord was going to protect his people. So who are his people? In this setting, right now, who are his people? See, that's an important question. Well, the Jews, those are his people. No, they're not. No, they're not. Those are not his people in this city. The Jews have lost their covenant. This is the day of judgment. His people are Christians. The Lord's people are the spiritual Jerusalem. That's what Paul talks about. So when he's doing this, so keep that in mind as we continue this. When he talks about his people and he starts to draw into Jerusalem, he's talking about the Messianic kingdom citizens, which are Christians. And that's what's amazing. And we get lost and we think, oh, it's just those that were Jewish in the city. And that's why we go, wait a minute, it's contradiction. I thought they destroyed it, but yet some got out. You know, his people, he's going to do battle for his people. No, well, his people are not the Jews by genealogy. It's those that are spiritual. And that's what is kind of confusing at times. He says, you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach Azel, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, all the holy ones with him. He's going to gather. He's going to protect. This is what he's talking about. Historically referenced was a massive earthquake that was something that you would, like, I don't know, the LA earthquakes, the San Francisco earthquake. I mean, we have things that we would say, well, 9/11. If I just said that, as in the days of 9/11, you know, you'd go, oh yeah, I understand. That was horrible, horrific. And that's kind of the setting of that. But 6 and 11 now looks at a transformed creation in the way. And so on that day, here we go. Remember that? On that day, we're still in that same time period specifically. So he's using a lot of things in symbology as well, light, things like this. On that day, there shall be no light, cold, nor frost, and there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but an evening time, where there shall be light. And on the day, living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half to the western sea. It shall continue in the summer as in the winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. That's the unification of everything. But again, the key things we can see that probably you may be a little familiar with is this idea of living waters and flowing from. The prophets also talked about how that from Zion would flow forward the word of God. That's part of the promise to Abraham as well, that it would come from this his people, but also out of Zion. Zion's always been significant, that the source would start from there and then go out further. And the flow basically is showing, without getting to a map, it's going to start there and spread out. And he is now going to be king over the whole earth. This is something that is kind of one of those spiritual warfare things that if you look at, that Satan and the principalities that Paul talks about, how that they have been allowed to have certain rule. And that when Christ ascended and took captive, it describes there, really what it's showing is a decisive defeat of all the spiritual entities of evil, and that now all rule and power has been reconciled. All peoples and generations are coming back and under one king. No longer was God going to allow these evil entities to have these influences around. And that's a deeper conversation. But that's the illusion showing how this unification of God back and being the one king. And then he says, the whole shall be turned into a plain from Gibeah to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, from the tower of Hanel to the king's winepress, and it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of other destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. Now, what's Jerusalem? Because we know Jerusalem is not dwelling in security. And this is where you go to the Hebrew writer when he compares the Mount Sinai receiving of the law and how terrifying when the mountain was burning. He says, we have not come to such, but we have come to what? A heavenly Jerusalem. That's where our citizenship is. So this is a description of that. Remember the scroll, the surveyor who went out, and Jerusalem was unmeasurable. It was massive. This is the fulfillment showing in this spiritual kingdom, the church, the body of Christ, how that it was going to rise above. None of us know what these gates are, but to the Hebrew, they would have a more significance to them. But the point we can see is never again was God going to bring a judgment of destruction upon it. Now, historically, physically, man, it's been run over time and time again. So this cannot be the physical one as well. 12 through 15, a judgment on the nations against all peoples, all races, I'm going to say, all the different, the Parthians, the Medes, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, all nations as such. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets. Their tongues will rot in their mouths. And on that day, a great panic from the Lord shall fall upon them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of one will be raised against the hand of the other. It's pretty graphic. This is the wickedness that God is going to, this punishment upon, again, just keep that in mind without breaking it all down, how God is going to strike your enemies. Now remember, whenever the people were trying to do God's work, they were being distracted by the idea that these enemies could take over and crush them, not understanding God is protecting them. And so the same way with God's spiritual kingdom, he's taking care of the enemies and he's going to remove them. And he said, even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and there the wealth of all surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, and the donkeys, and whatever beast may be in those camps. There is some historical things that we can look at. Even Titus, when he was emperor, he's the one that destroyed Jerusalem. And we can look at some of the things that started happening to Rome. There were plagues. There were earthquakes. Mount Vesuvius exploded. If you recall that, Pompeii was buried. That was during Titus. I mean, as early as like 75 AD. We do see some things that were pretty amazing that start happening around, and some of those you could probably tie back. And there were limited plagues, and we know ultimately by the time you get to the 6th century, the Black Plague starts to come upon the Roman Empire right at the beginning, the last of it falling and going into the Dark Ages and the end of Rome. So that's just the graphic picture he is showing this. And then he unifies, talking about how that worship is going to be one. There's not all the people that he's brought back and reconciled. Paul talks about it as a mystery in Ephesians, how that the Gentiles and the Jews were all going to be reconciled back. And so this as well, talking about this universal one worship. Everyone who survives of all the nations that have come up against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and keep the feast of booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be a plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up and keep the feast of booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt and to the punishment of all nations that do not go up and keep the feast of booths. Now, very Jewish. How many people know all their feasts? The Feast of Booths was a tabernacle. They would celebrate that in showing the time that they were nomadic, and showing the tabernacle was a place in which they would come and set up these temporary places that they would live, and showing to God. So as far as looking at the totality of this, is that one, now God is going to expect all the nations, not just the covenant relationship that was just the Hebrews and the Jews, but now he, as being unified kingship over all the earth, that now all of them he was expecting would have to come to the Lord through Christ, the Messiah. And that if they don't, they're going to be punished, that there would be a lack of those blessings. It's almost similar to the way that what God had told the Hebrews in the law of Moses, that if they followed God and they worshiped him correctly, he would bring blessings upon them. And if they didn't, then God was going to inflict punishment upon them, or blessing. So you choose today, life, blessings, follow me, or punishment. And that's kind of what he has given a pronouncing to the world. He's saying, follow me. I've now unified in my Son one rule, and you will be blessed. And if you don't, it's not going to go well. You're going to be punished. 20 and 21, as we wrap it up, is this idea of holiness permeates throughout all. And so on that day, here we go again, and on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of horses, holy to the Lord. And the pots in the houses of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. The kingdom is pure. Even if you don't understand anything there. The idea is there is no impurity in the kingdom of the Messiah. You say, well, wait a minute. Did you know about sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so that was a Christian? Well, did you know they're not in the kingdom? The spiritual kingdom is pure. Now, whether you're a part of it or not, I don't know. But if you're unrepentant, you're not in the kingdom. opposed to the Jewish system, to where you could have a very sinful, corrupt priest offering sacrifices, which then defiled everything that he touched. And so it would have a corruption. And so they understood this, the importance of cleanliness and purity in the worship of God. And so this is almost like an impossible task, that everything in the kingdom of Christ would be pure. How can that be? We've seen it. Well, again, we need to transcend beyond just this physical world and understand that this kingdom of Christ is far superior to all of it. That's why you cannot destroy it. It cannot be corrupted. And that's this amazing picture of that. And that's why it's so important for us to really evaluate our lives and how we're living, and not to be fooled in thinking, well, I'm a part of the kingdom. Well, if you have unrepentant sin, no, you're not. God's kingdom will continue to prosper. It's going to continue to grow until the day that Jesus turns this kingdom over to his heavenly Father. And so that is Zechariah. If you're here this evening and somehow we can help you at all in your relationship with him, I hope that you'll take the time to evaluate it. We're going to be singing this song, and it's a moment for us to reflect and see, are you in the kingdom? Are we really living a way that would help us to be sanctified and keeping us in that relationship and being a part of that beautiful kingdom that he has brought in at such a high price of his son's blood? So if there's something we can do to help you during that song, come forward while we stand and sing.